I have two big hobbies in my life, flying and photography, and there's nothing better than combining the two together. I love to share our privileged pastime with others and try to show how very lucky we are. Phone and point and click cameras have come a long way recently and take some amazing images, but I still like to use a proper digital SLR camera to take my shots. It usually gives more control and allows for more creative shooting, especially in the unique lighting environments of a small aircraft's cockpit. So today I'd like to take you along on a short flight on a fairly dull winter's day to show you just how I set up and use my camera safely and as the only pilot and cameraman on board. I've split this video into two parts. In this episode we'll take a deep dive into the camera's exposure control system and the settings I use. In part 2 I'll show you how I process the images on the computer to get the very best out of them. Right, let's get on with it. First thing to do is make sure your canopy is nice and clean. So, first thing you want to do before you even get up in the air is make sure your lens is nice and clean. And I've got this Canon EOS 90D, excellent little camera, and it's got an EFS, it's got a Canon EFS 10 to 22 mm lens on it, which I found to be the best lens for our cockpit. It's pretty wide, but you can narrow it down a bit. So what I do is I set up my camera first of all, but the first thing I do is I make sure, one, there's an SD card in it, and two, that it's going to take a picture. So I just take a random picture, and yeah, there you go. So it's working okay, plenty of battery. I charged it yesterday, and I've put it on TV, which is time intervals, and I set the time interval initially to 320, and I'll put the ISO on 100 initially, and that will change later on as it gets darker, but initially it's on ISO 100 and 3/20th of a second, and that'll end up blurring the prop, but also keeping everything else pretty much sharp, including the instruments. So let's get on board. At this point it's worth having a quick overview of how a camera controls the light to capture a photo, or more specifically what the main three settings on a digital SLR camera are and how they affect your final image. Let's start by taking a look at how the camera controls the amount of light it lets through the lens and onto the image sensor, or in the old days onto the film. Located in the lens portion on most digital SLR cameras is a concentric series of blades that can be adjusted automatically or manually to narrow down the hole that lets the light through from the front of the lens. It works similar to the iris in your eyes. This has two effects. The first is to adjust the amount of light getting through to the sensor. For example, on a really bright day you may want to reduce the amount of light to avoid overexposing your image, and if the light is poor you may want to open it up to let more light in. The secondary effect that the aperture has on the image is when fully open the image can become quite soft, especially at the edges due to the optical nature of the lens, and by narrowing down the aperture the image will become much sharper. The aperture opening has a measurement scale based on f-stops, basically the points where the aperture steps down. So as an example, and all lenses are different and may not have all these stops, but a setting of f1.4 would mean that the aperture was fully open and letting in the maximum amount of light for that lens. The next f-stop may be f2.8, which would let in half as much light as f1.4. Set the aperture at f5.6 and you've got half as much light again getting in as f2.8 and so on. Phone and most point and click cameras won't have an adjustable aperture and will instead use a combination of the next two light controls to expose the image correctly. Most people are aware that when you push the button to take a photo, you're exposing the sensor or the film to the light coming in through the lens. Depending on how long that shutter stays open will affect how much light hits the sensor. A long opening time or exposure will allow lots of light in, but will require a steady hand or a tripod to keep the camera still to stop the image from becoming blurry. A fast shutter speed will give a sharp, crisp image and can be great for freezing the action, but may not be open long enough to let in enough light, which can cause the image to be underexposed. Shutter speeds are normally displayed in seconds or fractions of a second and relate to the length of time that the shutter is actually open and letting in light. For example, anything above 1/60th of a second would be a fast enough shutter setting to handhold the camera in most static scenarios without blurring the image through movement. Whereas below that, the camera would normally be required to be stabilised either with a tripod or electronic stabilisation. Shutter speeds can be set either automatically or manually on most digital SLR cameras, and many, but not always, on point and click or phone cameras. Traditional film cameras have the option of using film with different sensitivity to light. This is known as the film speed or ISO. Film stock is available at speeds from as slow as ISO 20 to as high as ISO 3200. For example, if you had lots of available light, you would load a film into the camera that was, say, ISO 200, and if the light was not so good, you maybe would use an ISO 800. But once installed into the camera, you were stuck with this. The higher the sensitivity of the film, the more grain or noise would show up in the final image. Digital cameras still retain ISO, but is now a manual or automatic adjustment that you or the camera can adjust on a shot-by-shot basis to get the best exposure for your image. The ISO setting on a digital camera is adjusting the sensitivity to light of the camera's sensor, but like film, the higher or faster you set it, the more noise will be present in the image. A digital camera's ISO settings usually range from ISO 100 through to ISO 3200. Ideally, we would always try and use between ISO 100 to ISO 400 to get the cleanest noise-free image. By combining the f-stop or aperture setting with the shutter speed and ISO setting will determine whether your image is exposed correctly. Now, I appreciate all this sounds really complicated, and if you got this far, then thank you. But luckily, there's an auto function on pretty much every digital camera that works all this out for you. However, sometimes you may want to dial in a specific setting to get a certain result, and this is done by partial automation. All digital SLR cameras and some point and click and phone cameras allow you to adjust one or two of the three exposure settings manually, usually for creative reasons. They do this through either aperture priority or AP, or as on my Canon camera, AV mode, which lets you set a specific f-stop, say f2.8, and the camera will adjust the shutter speed and the ISO to ensure the image is correctly exposed. Or you can use shutter priority or SP mode, or as on my Canon, it's TV mode, which locks in your desired shutter speed and adjusts aperture and ISO to keep things sweet. This is the mode I set when shooting in the cockpit. I want everything as sharp as possible inside the cabin so you can see the instruments properly, but outside I want the propeller to be blurred. I don't want it to totally disappear with a really slow shutter speed, so I set the shutter opening time in shutter priority or TV mode, above 250th of a second but below 400th of a second. That way I get to show that the prop is moving while still keeping everything else nice and crisp. The scenery outside of the canopy will always be quite soft as I focus on the instruments, but that's fine. If it's daytime, I will also manually set the ISO to ISO 100. That way the image will be as clean as possible. However, if the light starts to get a bit poor, or as is the case when flying near dusk, I will set the ISO to auto later on in the flight. One last thing I do is make sure I'm shooting my images in a RAW format. This is rarely available on point and click cameras, but some newer phones allow you to use this. By default, a digital camera will take the full image after exposure from the sensor and do some magical processing on it to make sure the image is as good as it thinks it should be. It will then save it, usually as a JPEG file. Saving as a RAW file or a CR3 file in my Canon 90D means that the file contains a full dump of the sensor data without any processing by the camera. When you look at the raw image on the back of the camera display, it may look bad, but that's fine as we will be processing it later on. Okay, as a reminder, for daytime flying in reasonable light, shooting inside the cockpit, my settings are TV or shutter priority mode with the shutter speed set at between 1/250th of a second and 1/320th of a second, and the ISO manually dialed in at ISO 100. The camera's automatics will adjust the aperture to try and make the image exposed correctly, and all of this is set on the ground before departure. These settings will cover most shots through the cockpit canopy in good light, but once it starts to get cloudier or darker, try changing the manual ISO setting from 100 to auto. So our camera is all set up.
201, nobody traffic to set you back track.
Because we don't want to be, and one other thing that I do is I take the strap off of it. This is a safety feature because I don't want it getting caught around anything or snagging on a parachute or throttle or anything. So I'll leave the camera pretty much so that it is free. I have got my tripod mount on it at the moment, which I don't normally have. Another thing I do is stow the camera in the back before takeoff so that it doesn't fall on the floor. I'll move it from the back to the passenger seat once we're safely in the air. Your first priority as pilot in command is flying the aircraft. Taking photos or in fact doing any other activity whilst flying can only be done if it will not affect the safety of the flight. That's why I set up the camera whilst on the ground and place it on the seat next to me, all ready to shoot, but only when it is safe to do so. Once clear of the circuit and at altitude, and if there's something interesting to photograph, I'll pull out the camera. I seem to get some very nice comments about my photos when I post them on social media, but I'll let you into a little secret. I rarely look through the viewfinder, and often just pick up the camera and point it in the rough direction where I want to take a shot, and then press the shutter button. A lot. The beauty of digital is you can pretty much take as many photos as you like for no cost. So often I'll end up with 20 odd photos of exactly the same thing. But that's okay, as I can choose the best one when I process them on the computer at home. The sky can be spectacular, but looking down on cloud always makes for a great photo, so I'll climb above some thin stuff and get some shots. I've kept the same camera settings up until now, with the camera set to shutter priority mode with a fixed shutter setting of 1/320th of a second and the ISOs at 100. As it's starting to get darker, I've now changed the shutter speed to 2/50th of a second and put the ISO in auto mode, giving the camera more options to expose the photo correctly. The reduced shutter speed will let more light in, and I'll accept a little more noise from the ISO increase because I don't want my images to be underexposed, especially around the darker areas of the cabin. If I can, I'll try to get a traffic service, but either way I'm always super vigilant for other aircraft and of my position in relation to airspace before and during the time I'm using the camera. I'll also take shots in small bursts, that way my 100% attention is only away from the flying for a very short time. Most cameras autofocus will try to focus on the nearest subject and will normally expose for that. So when I take a shot out of the front through the prop showing the instrument panel, I let the camera's autofocus system focus on a point around the top of the glare shield, but I ensure the focusing is locked onto the instruments. You want to try and get a good exposure balance between the dark of the cockpit and the light of the scenery outside, and by selecting the top of the glare shield you normally get a good medium exposure. That way you'll have more scope to adjust the image on the computer later on. I'll pop a link below in the description where I'll give you some of these raw files taken directly from my camera for you to play with. Right, the light is going and it's starting to get dark, so I need to head back to the airfield. I'll catch you lot later. So that does it for part 1 of this episode. If you're interested, part 2 looks at processing the images I've taken to get the very best out of them. What's your thoughts about taking photos while solo, and what type of camera do you use? Please pop your comments in the section below. I'd love to hear about your thoughts, experiences or recommendations, and I'll try to read every comment. Thank you so much for watching. I've really enjoyed making this video and I always enjoy sharing our hobby through photography. If you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing and don't forget to hit the notification bell so I can let you know next time I upload a video. Hopefully you found this video interesting, but please note I'm not an instructor. This is all based on my personal experience as a private pilot in the UK. Fly safe guys, and Shortfield out.